the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Destination Mecca by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Chapter 14. In Search of Solomon's Mines. There was something strangely familiar, and at the same time very odd, about the atmosphere of Port Sudan. Just a short flight in an Arabian aeroplane, a hop across the Red Sea, and I was in another world. The twin British and Egyptian flags of the condominium fluttered over an orderly collection of airport buildings. We taxied to a stop, and a strapping, coal-black officer dusted the whole machine with DDT. As the door opened and we passengers were led blinking into the harsh sunlight, a truckload of khaki-clad figures descended upon us, their shining faces wreathed in a sort of round, easygoing smile that would have been unknown in the dignity-conscious Saudi land. After a year in the holy land of Islam, American soft drinks, American ways, and what I can only call desert-mindedness, I experienced anew the sense of being in a British-inspired society again. Not that there seemed to be anyone from the United Kingdom in sight. Customs officials, police, white-draped idlers, all were Sudanese. The sensation deepened in the town itself. There is a feeling of almost old-world Britain throughout the Sudan's vast million square miles that somehow is never incongruous. Neatly spaced rows of buildings, towering servants with tribal slashes on their cheeks, wearing English badges on their snowy turbans, British cars driving on the left and not on the right, these and 100 other things struck me with considerable force. I had three main objectives in the Sudan. I wanted to see the fabulous Sir Syed Abdur Rahman, leader of the Mahdi movement started by his father, and which is associated with the War of Kitchener and Gordon. I wanted to get the first picture, if it was possible, of the interior of the Mahdi's tomb at Omdurman, to see something of the mines said to have been worked by minions, or genii, depending upon your attitude, of King Solomon, son of David. And there was another thing. Soon after I landed, I heard that it was not allowed to take pictures in the Legislative Assembly building at Khartoum, so it struck me that it might be a good idea to have a stab at that as well. Posed pictures had been taken, but none actually during debates. I wanted to get in somehow and give my concealed camera a chance of action. As I saw it, the tomb was the more dangerous. Caught in the Parliament building, the very worst thing that could happen would be deportation, and probably not that. But alone in Omdurman, among the enthusiastic 100%ers of Mahdism, one might be roughly handled, to say the least. I decided first to take a few days off and taste the delights of Port Sudan. Through the streets that autumn evening strolled long-limbed Sudanese, almost invariably dressed in startling white. You could tell by their turbans whether or not they belonged to the Mahdist party. Some supporters of Egypt wore the fez, and khaki, badgeless uniforms seemed to be coming into vogue as well. Indian families in their national dress made a splash of colour against the biscuit drabness of the African sand. Down by the port I went for a trip in a glass-bottomed boat, fascinating by the milling, multicoloured Red Sea fishes that must be worth something to any aquarium. Anyone with a cine camera and colour film here could make a picture well worthwhile without venturing outside the shelter of the port itself. It is whispered that certain intrepid explorers had done just that, much to the amusement of the Sudanese when the films were shown there. It is quite a local relaxation to visit the ships from India and Aden which have called here during the day. Crowds of Indonesian pilgrims in red and green sarongs were welcoming fellow countrymen off a liner packed with Australians en route to Britain. As a party of English-speaking tourists stopped to watch the self-inflating bluey jellyfish washed up on the shore, I raised my camera, forgetting my Arabian robes, sandals, rosary, and curly black beard. "Could I have a picture, please?" They seemed frozen to the spot. Then they all burst out laughing. They were apparently Australians, mother, father, and 3 teenage daughters. The father grinned at me. "Who do you think you are, cobber? Lawrence of Arabia?" I suppose something was incongruous. It must have been my English, but I couldn't help it if I went to school in England. I did not quite know whether to be annoyed or not, but I made my way back to the hotel, shaved my beard, and put on a white suit. Here and there among the dawdling crowds of the town I saw small groups of men, striding purposefully towards the port. Under their arms they carried a long, thick roll of camel hair rope, the badge of the porter since the days of the Arabian Nights. In their astonishingly woolly hair was stuck the traditional curl pin, which showed that they were Hadendower, the Fuzzy Wuzzies, Kipling's benighted heathens but damned good fighting men, who broke the British square during the Sudan War, because we did not know it was invincible, is the joke enjoyed today by Sudanese and Britishers alike in these cordial times, and have never forgotten it. These, as I had heard, were the wanderers and camel men whom nature had deputed to surround the supposed area of Solomon's Mines. After a good deal of thought and planning, I struck northwards along the Red Sea coast to look for the mines. It sounds simple, but if you have some idea of the geography, you will see that it was a pretty silly idea. For hundreds of miles there is nothing but desert on one side, salt water on the other. Wells are few and far between. There is no Ibn Saud here to drill artesian wells out of apparent nothingness, no magic lamp filled with Arabian oil to conjure up asphalted roads and police the free land that the Hadendower call home. My information was scanty and my capital was small. I knew that somewhere here there lived a stubborn Irishman and his wife, who after 20 years of hardship were making the mines pay. I knew that people were not supposed to visit the area. Why? You could take your pick of the reasons. The civil authorities pointed to the undeniable fact that only recently a truckload of rash explorers had lost their way and died in awful agony from thirst. The local civilians whispered that the Fuzzy Wuzzies were unreliable and would fight anyone who they thought might try to open up the mines. Some people in an Arab cafe said that friends of theirs had tried to reach the reefs, but that their heads had been politely returned by the tribesmen, with a message to the effect that they would always be pleased to return for burial any heads of travellers who lost their way. The more politically minded youths whom I ran across in various offices and clubs swore, depending on their politics, that the British or the Egyptians each did not want the other party to get the fabulous treasure first. An official of the Geological Survey stoutly maintained that there was no gold there. No, it had not been surveyed for some time, there were no maps, there was no journalistic story there at all, only thirst and Hadendowers. No writer had ever been there. I did not mention that I had a geology diploma, or that I had examined samples just across the Red Sea in Arabia, which made me think that the workings there were complemented by Sudanese mines, because I felt that this might arouse suspicion that I was working for the Egyptians, British, or gold syndicates. After a good deal of wandering, I finally came across the 100-odd immense workings which once supplied the riches of the pharaohs. In spite of the unparalleled expansion of almost every form of production and industry in this land 1/3 the size of Europe, the mines which formerly yielded Nubian treasure for both Africa and Asia remained unworked. Officially, that is. I had searched ancient records and travel stories, made some sort of study of the ways and history of the dynastic Egyptians and the Israelites, and was fully convinced of the existence of the mines and of the riches they had once provided. The Sudanese themselves, Nubians, Pharaohs, Phoenicians, and Arabs, have in turn fought and intrigued for control of the gold extraction industry. Today, working somewhere among the gigantic 6,000-year-old slag heaps, was that lone Irish miner. I found no trace of him then, but met him later in a luxury hotel in Khartoum, where he was spending a holiday with his wife. He told me that things would be very much easier if local capital could be interested in the scheme for reopening mines, but money begets money so fast here in cotton that there was really very little chance that anyone would put anything into gold. He told me a good deal about the area where he worked, but for certain reasons I was not able to say that I had already been over the field. At one place, near Darahaib, I found 2 slate castles probably dating from pharaonic times, towering over workings extending many hundreds of yards. Here the gold-bearing rock still reaches a thickness of as much as 12 feet, and assays showed the comparatively high yield of 4 ounces to the ton. But how to provide water for the washing processes, where to get and how to transport crushing rollers, amalgamation tables, how to gain the sympathy of the hovering Hadendawa, and how to make them work for you, especially when they could, and did, do their own mining on a modest though sufficient scale. They are not a greedy people, and the offer of greater riches than they could themselves win from what they regard as their own mines would not in the least attract them. When the Sudan and Abyssinia formed one country, the undefined up-country area of the ancient Egyptian hinterland, this and no other was the center of feverish activity to extract precious metal in response to the emperor's incessant calls. Many thousands of slaves toiled night and day, literally, as contemporary records show, to accumulate for the monarchs of the Nile a treasure so great that, even today, it is almost incalculable. Gold became so abundant throughout Egypt during the time of Menes, the first known pharaoh, that the value of silver in comparison was actually higher. Picture the scene. At some places, the mine entrances are either sealed or lost, having been blocked by the Sudanese when Arab conquerors swept over the country. In most cases, the towering slag heaps, resembling those of industrial England, stand out against both the dun brown of the desert and the blue of the sky. Unaffected by the weathering action of the fine-blown sand, the silica matrix rock gleams here and there with tiny twinkling specks of false gold. Once inside one of the workings, there is something more than just eerie about the silent maze of intersecting galleries, the abandoned piles of earthenware crucibles, and the strange silence of the place. Millions of bats now dwell in places where the preservation of even chisel markings seem to point to recent exploitation. But it is impossible that such tunnels could have been dug without literally thousands of labourers. It takes little imagination to feel, as I did more than once, that one might run across a barbarian soldier standing guard over the neatly piled stocks of perhaps 50,000 crucibles, each one a complete replica, or perhaps I should say prototype, of those still in laboratory use 60 centuries later. We are fortunate in having access to detailed descriptions of the methods of work used in those days. Agatharchides, writing as late as 140 BC, tells of the period when the industry reached the peak of its efficiency. Thousands of war prisoners and sometimes entire families slaved in the fury of near-equatorial heat under the lash of relentless barbarian mercenary guardians. He describes how the vast numbers employed are bound in fetters and compelled to work night and day without pause and with no hope of escape, for they are under savage soldiers who speak a foreign tongue, and there is no intercourse possible between them. At the site of some of these slave camps, the huts of the workers endure even to this day. Every few hundred yards, the monotonous pattern of clay-built dwellings is broken by a larger and better constructed house. In this probably lived the guardians assigned to this particular section of the slave quarters. Gold mining under the Egyptians was no haphazard affair, but a highly organized industry. There can be little doubt that, due to the fact that the territory has never been adequately surveyed, many really rich deposits may exist and await rediscovery. At one time, during the earlier years of Western interest in the Sudan, companies sprang up and sought exploitation and exploration rights, but they seldom progressed far. Capitalists, at least during that time, were never marked by the pioneer spirit which would be needed almost in the nth degree to survive here. There seems to me to be evidence that quite a number of these diggings were abandoned or deliberately blocked at various periods of history, probably on the advent of invaders. There is one explanation why the mines known at present are believed not to be those from which the greatest treasures were obtained. Their yield was probably never as high as the deposits described by the ancients, or anything like as economic. It must be remembered that even slave labor can be uneconomic, for mercenary guards have to be paid, and some sort of livelihood for the prisoners must be provided. Geologists are of the opinion that natural water and food were never sufficient here to support any type of community, and hence their provision would mean something of an expense. If, for the sake of argument, any of the fabled rich veins were to be discovered by some traveller today, there might be considerable possibilities for development. I, for one, would be more than keen to go further into this fascinating problem. With the tunnels still intact and some of the ancient equipment available for the using, it is not surprising that the local fuzzy-wuzzies carry on something of a skeleton industry in gold extraction themselves. Taking pieces of gold-bearing rock, which they have learnt to identify, the wily warriors crush and separate them, much as their predecessors did several thousand years ago. The Nubians of this area alone by the 17th century BC, it is recorded, were providing Egypt with a tribute of £750,000 worth of gold each year from their own mines. By the time of the 19th dynasty, in the 14th century BC, the gold mines were stated to be sending the present-day equivalent of £650 million sterling annually, as Diodorus informs us in his chronicles. And most of this was sheer profit. The prisoners were not paid or clothed. Their houses were built by themselves. No attention is paid to their persons. They have not even a rag to cover themselves. And so wretched is their condition that all who witness it deplore the excessive misery they endure. No rest, no intermission from toil is given to the sick or maimed. So wrote Agatharchides. There are still mysteries surrounding the strange deserted Nubian mines. It is not known where the ancients obtained the water that they must have used. While there are some mines near the Nile banks, where water could be had in plentiful supply, yet in other places the nearest spring or well may be 100 miles away. It is obvious that water was used. The equipment that I inspected there proves that it was indispensable to the workings, and in fair abundance for that, if not for the prisoners. Geological evidence replies that there has almost certainly not been in human times a water supply in the right part of these sandy wastes. Certainly there is nothing, here or anywhere else, to show that the peoples of those times possessed mechanical gold ore separators for which water would not be used. When the Arabs conquered the country in the 7th century, their own legends of King Solomon's mines told them to look for them north of what is now Port Sudan. The apparent lack of an explanation of how the mining was done and other mysteries were clearly explained, to their minds, by the same legendary tales of the son of David. It is not difficult to see why. How, for example, can we explain the method of lighting a 300-foot tunnel which has no indication of known artificial light being used? Unlike most of the mines of similar antiquity, there is no trace of lamp or candle carbon on the walls or roofs. Only one lamp, and that from a late Roman period, has ever been found, and this in spite of the fact that hundreds of relics of the time, still scattered in local profusion, include almost every other type of article of contemporary use, even down to small personal possessions such as combs. If lamps or other artificial means of illumination were in use, it can be argued, some trace of them should remain. Elementary inspection of the underground workings showed that it would be impossible for a normal, or even if it comes to that, abnormal person to work along the veins without some form of portable light. According to Arab story, the mines were actually worked by jinn, and these genii used magical methods of lighting and worked ceaselessly for their master, the lord of all the supernatural beings. Comparable mines, which have been excavated in exactly the same way, are to be found in Arabia. Those that I saw there, less than 200 miles away, just across the Red Sea, are almost identical with the Sudanese mystery mines and may have been worked at about the same period, and even by the same people. Historians have agreed that the Arabian Hejaz mines and those of the Hadendowa land may quite well date from King Solomon's day. Having extracted the ore piece by piece, and as the slaves obviously did, how did they know which lumps were gold-bearing? For they certainly did know. No method that was employed can even be guessed at. Their sorting methods were so amazingly efficient that in hundreds of tons of rejected ore still to be seen, only a few pieces containing payable gold seem to have escaped their scrutiny. Gold occurring in quartz is very often invisible to the naked eye, yet these men of Pharaoh's time found it. They knew, without powdering the rock, if it contained sufficient gold to be worth extracting or not. As for the finished article, ancient Egyptian gold recently scientifically analyzed showed it to be 22.3 carats fine. Only 7/10 of a carat was impurities. In the deep south of the Sudan, another form of gold extraction was shown to me in my search for Solomon's mines. On the Ethiopian border, the Negroes pan gold dust and nuggets from the stream. They, like their fellows in the north, refer to this area as the Mines of Solomon. The fabulous land of Punt of ancient times was probably composed of the Sudan plus the countries on the Arab side of the Red Sea, Yemen and the Hejaz. When it is remembered that it was from Punt that Solomon is said to have received his golden treasures, a case might be made out for thinking that the Sudan mines do, indeed, form part of a group which enriched the Israelite king of old. The veteran American engineer K.S. Twitchell speaks of the legend that Gariyat mine across the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia was worked by the miners of King David, father of King Solomon. He also concludes that the Mahad Dahab, cradle of gold, near Jeddah, might have been a source of the gold of King Solomon. It may possibly be called one of King Solomon's mines. 1,000 years before Christ, the Phoenicians traded with the Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Yemen. They also had, we are told, strong ties with Solomon and worked with him in mercantile ventures. Whatever is the truth of the matter, nothing much more can definitely be established until further written evidence is discovered. There is nevertheless a lure about the reputed mines of Solomon that seems to tug at the mind. The urge to dig for gold probably exists in most people, and a time will come when Solomon's mines receive attention from further prospectors. And I shall always believe that there is a scope for enterprise among the silent monuments of a rarely visited area. I shook off the magic of the land of Punt, for it was time to journey inland, to the heart of Mahdiland. Chapter 15. Mahdism on the March. 60 years ago, General Gordon died in the Sudan, and all England was agog as the dreaded Mahdi, religious leader of 7 million people and 1 million square miles, threatened to sweep all Africa and the East clear of foreign rule. Muhammad Ahmed, taking advantage of certain traditional prophecies about the rightly guided one, who was to free Islam and lead the faithful to final victory over the world, raised the standard of rebellion against Egypt in the 1880s. Muhammad Ali, the Great of Egypt, a man driven by a burning desire to see his country strong, revived the age-old dream of a greater Egypt, stretching from the Mediterranean to the equator, and a new pharaonic dynasty. Some Sudanese objected to Egyptian troops in their country. Britain was dragged in as a rather less than willing participant, hence Gordon and Kitchener's expedition, which seemed utterly to have crushed the power of Mahdism. The Mahdi was dead. His family and literally tens of thousands of his followers perished on the battlefield at Omdurman. Even the corpse of the leader, on the best possible advice, was dismembered and thrown into the White Nile. The era of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium had come. One thing prevented the complete destruction of the militant dervish creed. A delicate boy of 10, small for his age, fleeing southwards beyond Khartoum, was spared execution by Kitchener's men. Too young, they said. There had been enough bloodletting. Surely enough mangled corpses in their patched dervish cloaks, proud emirs and henchmen of the Caliph, had met their doom. The destruction, if not the rout, of the Sudanese world conquerors designate was complete. Enough had already been written about that campaign, and I was more interested in that boy of 10. Today that man is a multimillionaire whose every word rings throughout a territory 1/3 the size of all Europe, from the equatorial jungles to the deserts of the Red Sea shore. I left Port Sudan by air-conditioned train, travelling day and night for 22 hours through what seemed to deserve the name of illimitable wastes, if anything did. Hour after hour the khaki panorama hardly changed. The most that one could see was desert, stunted acacia trees, sometimes a cluster of huts which showed a small village or station. We were getting deep into Mahdiland and close to Khartoum itself, the capital at the junction of the Twin Niles. Whenever we stopped at a station, signs in Arabic and English would tell us, "Throwing coins or food to Sudanese is encouraging beggary and lessening self-respect." Nobody seemed to bother much about it, though, and tiny, appealing figures would politely hold out coloured baskets for sale. 100 yards away, the concrete beehive huts where the locals lived would be momentarily crowded by reserved elders, watching to see what luck their offspring were having with the passengers. They seemed to have plenty of luck. A railway official in the same carriage told an amusing thing about these beehives. The railway authorities, he said, were at one time disturbed by the fact that mud and straw huts had been declared unhygienic and dangerous. As the railway is one of the all-powerful organizations here, they immediately decided upon action. The traditional type of hut was measured, weighed, surveyed, and duplicated in hygienic concrete. These beehives were then built and exchanged with the locals for their own unhealthy homes, which were demolished and burnt. The Sudanese obediently moved in. After one day, they discovered that the huts were absolute infernos inside. They seemed to let the heat in and did not cool rapidly enough at night. So they took fresh daub and wattle and started new little villages at a respectful distance from the awful railway ovens, which were now known as English hells. Theoretically, said my friend, everyone is now happy. The official dwellings of the people are concrete huts. Their goats are supposed to live in the wattle huts. Only the goats probably feel that even the nights are getting warmer these days as they are led into concrete houses at sunset. I had a date with the son of the Mahdi, Sir Syed Abdur Rahman el-Mahdi Pasha, to his followers the lawful successor of the Prophet on earth. As our train drew into Khartoum station, a small deputation from the Daira administration of the Mahdi whisked me off the train into a large car and towards the glittering lights of the city itself. This first impression of Khartoum in the velvety African evening stands out in the memory with some force. Modern Khartoum, as I was soon to realize, is a town planned and built entirely from scratch on the flat open plain, which is all that was left when the Mahdis took down every ancient building and ferried them stone by stone across the river to build their own capital of Omdurman. The result is that there is nothing sordid about Khartoum. The streets are wide and well lit. Broad avenues of elephant bean trees run from one end of the place to the other. A little outside the actual centre of the city, on the road to Omdurman, lies the vast mass of the Governor-General's palace. The car ran past this building, parallel with the Nile, and came to a halt outside a huge hotel, standing in more grass than I had seen since I left Europe. "If you want anything, please ask. You are to pay for nothing. You are the guest of the Mahdiya," I was told. There was nothing Oriental about this place, and very little African either, for that matter. Here we were on not only European soil, as it were, but seemed actually in Britain. Englishmen with white tuxedos and red or black cummerbunds sipped their cocktails in the Palm Court. Vivacious groups of British colonial civil servant types drank in the cool air and chattered on the terrace. But here, as everywhere in the Sudan, there is no colour bar, and about a quarter of the guests were dressed in the flowing white gowns of the Mahdi community. But all was not well in the Sudan. According to the Egyptians, Britain was running the country as a colony and supporting the militant Mahdists. Egypt, they said, was not getting a fair share in the ruling of the condominium. Pro-Egyptians were being discriminated against. Propaganda was being carried out against the unity of the Nile Valley, some sort of unification of Egypt and the Sudan. Moreover, Egypt was not getting enough water, and the Sudan could cut off the supply when she wanted to. Control of the waters at this point, where the Niles meet, should be supervised by the country, which could literally be burned up if the flow were to stop. The followers of the Mahdi said that this was all nonsense, and that the Egyptians merely feared Mahdism because Sir Syed could become the king of an independent Sudan. They pointed to the racial and historical differences between the Egyptian and Sudanese people. The British had not much to say. They felt that they needed most of their energies in the administration of the country. The other great Sudanese politico-religious group, the Marganites, were against anything that was for Mahdism. Then there are the southern tribes, where men still worship trees and use razor blades for currency. Many of the equatorial tribesmen are, however, Christians, and missionaries wanted to know if they were to be left to the mercy of the Muslim majority. The pagans and the Muslims complained that the South Sudanese had been at the mercy of the missionaries for long enough, and so it went on. I went to see Sir Syed to get an idea of the Mahdist mind. Mahdism, as a system, is organized on the Arabian model. That is to say, the leader is practically absolute in his decisions, and is at the same time the chief of the community in religious as well as secular affairs. His schools, youth movements, cotton-growing empire, and political machine are all run from one enormous building where he also lives. When I was ushered into his presence, 10,000 drilled disciples stood below the balcony of the cream and green palace. Raising the spear and crescent moon emblem of the movement, cheerleaders gave the blood-tingling call that once re-echoed over the battlefield at Omdurman. One God, Allah. One leader, the Mahdi. Syed Abdur Rahman started life in exile, providing for his mother by selling wood which he collected with his bare hands and sold from door to door. His personal fortune today is estimated at £6 million, and you can see in his face that he has tasted both the bitterness and pleasures of struggle. Knighted by the British, he was so respected by Egypt that he was granted a pashadom by Farouk. Syed Abdur Rahman, literally servant of the most merciful, is nearing 70, which is not young for a Sudanese. He spoke slowly, weighing his words, as we sipped coffee and listened to the cheers ringing out below. Inside the palace, electric fans, fluorescent strip lighting, all the appurtenances of modernity clash a little with the personality of the grave patriarch's appearance. But those who know him say that behind that otherworldly demure smile is one of the fastest-thinking commercial brains in history. On the wall behind him hangs the Mahdi's sword, an heirloom taken centuries ago by one of his ancestors from a crusading German prince. If it were waved today before the endlessly marching hordes of Mahdi men, the country would be drenched with blood. His silken robes rustling, Sir Syed stood up to give me some idea of his plans. First, he said, we must have peace and welfare for the people. In the north, in places such as this, he waved his hand toward the orderly minarets of Khartoum beyond the window, there are few problems. Here we speak Arabic, dress in the same way, are expanding our cotton and agriculture. It is in the south, where they have no clothes, no education, no beliefs, that we must work to secure a united country. He said nothing for or against his main local opponent, the tiny, dynamic Sir Syed Margani Pasha, unless this could be taken as referring to him. When you have something to do, you must do it. It does not matter what other people say or think if you believe in your heart that you are right. Did our prophet worry about what the idolaters said when he had but one disciple? Did he run or fight when he was attacked and outnumbered by 100 to 1? Am I to model myself on any lesser man than that? Tantalizing glimpses of the Mahdi Empire at work were given me when I moved into the next house, at the leader's invitation. Looming just opposite was the nerve center of the organization, the Daira Palace. Telephones were ringing from dawn to far into the night. White-robed clerks worked with an intensity that recalls the activity of ants. So many thousand bales of cotton from the Mahdi's own fields, so many hundred vehicles to carry exports to the ships at Port Sudan, so many books for the Mahdi scout leaders, a delegation to see about starting new industries, endlessly the machine whirs. In the blistering heat of the day, all through the fasting month of Ramadan, morning, noon, and night it went on. Was I in New York or Chicago? Up the wide gravel pathways to the towering Daira's closely guarded gates, cars came in endless procession. Sir Abdur Rahman's right-hand man sweeps in for a conference with cotton buyers. Government officials, members of parliament, religious leaders from 1,000 miles up country fill the busy waiting halls where soft-footed servants carry sweet, thick mazbut coffee and pastries to the guests. It is all like one family in the Mahdi camp. Very often I found that a number of people working for the machine in various occupations were related. Syed Abdullahi, the present leader's brother-in-law, runs his own enormous import-export firm just a few blocks away, helped by an Oxford-educated son. Some of the key men in the departments of the organization are sons of tribal and village chiefs, upon whom Mahdism can rely to the death. Those who are accustomed to thinking analytically would be rather at a loss here. Is Mahdism itself preponderantly religious, commercial, educational, military? It is all of these, and a bit more. It is a community so interrelated and tightly organized that it may be unique in human organization. Membership of the Mahdi family in the Sudan almost always means that the person must work hard within the group. He may rise far towards the top. And as such, he is entitled to a tremendous amount of respect. Sir Syed was pleased when I told him that I planned to visit the tomb of his father across the river in Omdurman and to pay my respects to his memory. I obtained permission to photograph worshippers before the tomb and laid plans for getting pictures inside, if there was any way that this could be managed. In Omdurman, the silver-domed edifice is guarded by two of the few survivors of the battle, and they would be likely to disapprove of anyone who tried to snatch a picture of the interior, the most hallowed ground to them outside Arabia's shrines. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.